So Joseph received his PhD in environmental and evolutionary and systematic biology from Wayne State University. And before that, I guess he was an undergrad at Oberlin College. Among his honors is the fact that he was elected fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's one of the sensational 60 who were chosen to commemorate 60 years of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And in 2017, he was listed as one of the outstanding graduates in biology at Oberlin College. And he's been selected as an Innovator of the Year in US Black Engineer magazine. So Joseph's research deals with the evolutionary genomics of adaptations and our understanding of biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials. But he's also dealt with the issue of race in academia and in evolutionary biology in particular. And that's, I think, what his talk is going to focus on today. So Joseph, if you want to share your screen, we can get underway.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you all for inviting me to give this talk today. Do want to make a correction, and Ken wouldn't have known this, but I'm now in the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University. I was transferred over at the end of the academic year, so I'm no longer in the joint school. So the talk I'm going to give you today is a reiteration of something I gave in July of 2020. Now, this was right after the George Floyd murder. And I've been asked to give a talk to the graduate student associations of the three main evolution-related societies: Society for the Study of Evolution, the American Society of Naturalists, and the Society for Systemic Biology. Now, that full talk is available on YouTube, and I'm happy to provide this PowerPoint to you at the end of today's conversation, should anyone want to watch that entire thing. I'm going to try not to do that today, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss some of the specific questions that the students generated and the ones which I found most compelling in that session. Now, for many people who are not of African descent, and this is, the beginning of Black History Month, I have found that these people have little to no real understanding of the history of persons of African descent in the United States. And so what I've done here, and this is something that the geologists in the audience will appreciate, I've taken the history or some of the historical events that were important in African American history, and I've turned that history into 24-hour clock time. So we start the day at 12 a.m. with the first Africans arriving in Jamestown, Virginia. By 4:51 a.m. in the morning, the colonies that would become the United States already have laws that differentiate Africans from other servants. By 1:50 p.m., the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. And this, by the way, was in response to the rising abolitionist movement across the entire country. 2:43 p.m., the 13th Amendment ends slavery. At 3:33 p.m., Plessy versus Ferguson is decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, in which separate but equal facilities were considered constitutional. At 3:57 p.m., the second Morrill Land Grant Act founds the historically Black college and university land grant colleges. Now, most people aren't aware that there were two moral land grant acts. The first founded schools like North Carolina State or Michigan State, but in the South, these land grant institutions did not allow persons of African descent to become students there. So a second moral land grant act was necessary to provide for higher education for persons of African descent in the former Confederate States. At 5:57 p.m., we have Red Summer, in which race riots massacred African Americans across the United States. And now this, by the way, was in conjunction with the beginning of the great influenza pandemic of 1919. And these riots continued, with one of the worst of them being the Oklahoma City massacre in 1923. At 7:27 p.m., the Society for the Study of Evolution was founded. Now, in my 2019 paper, African Americans in Evolutionary Science, I make the point that when the society was founded, there were no persons of African descent there. There were no faculty members from historically Black colleges or universities there. So this was an entirely Eurocentric affair. At 7:49 p.m., the mass incarceration ratio in the United States is 4-to-1, meaning 4 African Americans are in prison for every 1 European American. At 8:07 p.m., Emmett Till was lynched. I was also born. Okay, let's see if we can do this next slide. Oops, let's go back up, yeah. At 8:25 p.m., the mass incarceration ratio is now 5-to-1. At 8:29, we have the Civil Rights Act, and for the first time in my life, I am actually considered or protected by law. So I wasn't protected by law until I was 9 years old. Okay, at 8:42 p.m., my parents could finally vote. At 9:01 p.m., the mass incarceration ratio is now 6-to-1. At 10:03 p.m., I became the first African American to earn a PhD in the field of evolutionary biology. And in that same year, George Bush sweeps to the White House, in part through the racist Willie Horton ads that were aired on television. 1 minute later, the mass incarceration ratio is 7-to-1 in the United States. At 11:12, Barack Obama was elected president, which some people thought hailed the beginning of a post-racial society. On that night, believe me, I celebrated as much as anyone. But I turned to my wife and I said, a lot of young African-American men are going to die for this. And sure enough, the murders of African-American men by police and other aspects of the state continued unabated. Eric Garner, Tamara Rice, Michael Brown, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so on. At 11:59 p.m., the net worth of a European American or a white family in America is $171,000 versus $17,500 for a Black family. Now, I actually updated this slide, and I should have given the updated slide with 11:59:45. White supremacist mob storms Capitol. So, to discuss this history of mass incarceration and police violence, I recommend this film, Profiled, which is listed at the bottom of the slide. It was produced by Kathleen Foster. I appear in this film discussing the history of racial ideology and the biology of race in the United States and how that played into justifications of police violence against persons of African descent. It's an excellent film, and again, the link is there if you want to see the trailer. All right, so right after George Floyd's murder, a number of scientific organizations, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the March for Science, the Society for the Study of Evolution, the Society for Neuroscience, Sigma Xi, everyone suddenly wanted to address institutional racism in the enterprise of science. Now, quite frankly, I had been talking about this for a good 30 years, pretty much throughout my entire career. And unfortunately, it took a public murder to get people to realize that the things that I and other scholars had been saying for all this time was true. Now, I found for the first time that, I'd written numerous journal articles about this problem in science. And finally, people were actually reading them. I saw my name popping up on Twitter all over the place. I was amazed, but it wasn't popping up for papers that I'd written in 2019. It was popping up for papers I'd written a decade before. So we have work to do. So I was asked by the scientist to draft a statement about the role that scientists might play in our movement for racial justice. And my co-author was Eric Jarvis. Eric Jarvis is a neuroscientist who holds an appointment at Rockefeller University. But one of the things that I found throughout my career is that folks in science seem not to understand how the scientific enterprise that they're part of plays a role in the injustice that we see operating in American society every day. And so the point of this piece was to bring to the forefront issues relating to how this enterprise of science works, what issues it addresses, what problems it chooses to solve, and which problems it chooses to leave to benign neglect, and how we might engage this process more effectively, and in particular, such that scientific careers might become more attractive to underserved and underrepresented communities. So, and again, much of what I wrote in the 2019, actually, it was 2020 now. The 2020 piece in The Scientist came from an earlier essay that I wrote called Science in the Belly of the Beast. And this was an essay directed to people who had already committed themselves to becoming scientific researchers. And I asked those researchers to consider 3 questions in their career. First, what are my goals? Second, how do they match the goals of the institutions I plan to work in? And then 3, what are the most appropriate strategies to achieve these goals? So things work best when your goals and that of the institution match each other. So for me, my goals were always first making a contribution to science, but I was very much different from most of my colleagues, because I also felt that by making a contribution to science, that I was also going to use those to advance social justice. And so the question immediately came forward, how do they match the goals of the institutions I plan to work in? Now, for those of you who don't, fully know the history of my career, I started out at historically white institutions, Research 1 institutions. Okay, I earned my tenure at a Research 1 institution. I was promoted to full professor at a Research 1 institution. It was later in my career that I decided to go to a historically Black university. So during those years, I found that historically white institutions agree with the first one. Okay, in other words, they want scientists to make contributions to science. But they also disagree with the last, and that is the hardest recognition that people need to address. Now, don't get me wrong, all of them will claim otherwise. All of them have statements about diversity and inclusion on their websites. But quite frankly, I don't judge people by what they say. I judge them by what they do. And in that sense, the Research 1 institutions of this country have failed miserably. And there are reasons for why they fail. And then part of it is because they seem not willing to address the contradiction between what they claim and what their mission actually has been. So, on the other hand, HBCUs agree with the first and are often confused on how to achieve the second. So finally, what are the most appropriate strategies to achieve these goals? Well, I realized that I first had to establish my credentials in the existing enterprise of science. In other words, I had to publish in top-tier research journals. I had to land research grants from National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and other federal funding agencies. I had to achieve promotion and tenure in the existing system. So no one could say that I was critiquing the existing system because I couldn't succeed in the existing system. I was able to do that. I was able to earn my PhD, advance through promotion and tenure, achieve full professorship, receive awards, and get elected to honorary positions in major scientific societies. So that in that sense, people can't undermine my critique of what's wrong with this enterprise by saying that I failed it, because I didn't. I actually excelled in it. And what I have been attempting to do is to create a network of individuals that wish to achieve the latter goal, which is utilize our science in advancing social justice. So many of you might recognize the picture at the bottom of the slide, as this is African American History Month. Some of you will not. That's actually a real picture of Harriet Tubman. And, Harriet couldn't do it by herself. She was part of a network, an underground railway. And in that sense, I've always seen myself as being a conductor on the underground railway of science. So, and then I addressed some of the specific issues that young URM faculty members often face. So one question was asked, can you suggest better ways to approach the greater burden on student service that I, as a Black faculty member, seem to have compared to other faculty at my level? So my first recommendation is that you have to learn to say no. You need to recognize that you're running a marathon and not a sprint. Now, I can give you real examples of this where I was at, and I'm not going to say the names of these institutions, but I was at one, Research 1 institution, and they wanted to create a Department of Ethnic Studies. Again, sounds like a laudable goal. You finally realized, that you need to allow for scholarship on folks that aren't persons of European descent. I'm 100% behind that. So they came to me, a biologist, to chair this department. And I said, well, okay, I'll think about this. But then when I asked for real resources to bring this department into fruition, the message was, oh, well, we're not going to give you any faculty positions. We're not going to give you a budget. So they basically wanted the existing faculty members to volunteer their time to create a curriculum and a department and a major of ethnic studies without any resources to support that happen. So my response was, oh, hell no. I said, as much as I would like to see that happen, I am not going to allow myself, and I'm not going to give support to the exploitation of already burdened URM faculty to take on this additional burden of creating an ethnic studies program. Now, they of course asked someone else, and that other person agreed to do it, which is, again, the lesson here. You have to learn how to say no, because if you allow the institution to utilize you without compensation, without support, without resources, then you're not going to make it. Now, another thing, with regards to how I organize my lab, I utilize the concept of tiered mentorship, even when I was an assistant professor. I trained my graduate and senior undergraduates, and I had them train and supervise the newer students. And by the way, I still do this. I lead a genomics research group here at North Carolina A&T that's composed of associate professors, assistant professors, postdoctoral researchers, graduate students, undergraduates, and every level is responsible for mentoring the level below it. And I provide leadership and mentorship for everybody. And so I organize, I have regular meetings with all the grad students, all the undergraduates, all the assistant professors. I work to make sure that my assistant professors make it through the promotion and tenure process to become associate professors, that my associate professors make it through the process to become full professors. I read their grants, I read their papers, I support them along this journey. And that support, I don't want to use the word trickles down, but it is networked down at every level of the research organization. And this is something that I sort of encourage senior faculty members to do. Now, I'm hoping that at some point I might be retiring soon. And so my mission now is to guarantee that when I step aside, there are people in place who know how this game works and who can keep the process going once I step off the stage. Now, another thing you can do is meet with your departmental chair and discuss your differential service load. So if possible, get him or her to recognize that in writing your annual reviews. And in that way, this is documented when you come up for promotion and tenure. Now, when I chaired the promotion and tenure committee at another prestigious Research One institution, what I saw coming across the process, particularly for promotion to full professor, is you would see males of European descent, with strong research portfolios and so teaching evaluations and virtually no service. You would see female and faculty members with not quite as strong research portfolios but much better teaching evaluations and much greater service to the institution. Now, before I was chair of promotion and tenure, the European American males were the ones being promoted to full professor. The women and minority professors were stuck at associate professor. When I became chair of promotion and tenure, I said, no. The institution's criteria clearly say that you have to have excellence in all three of these arenas. And so people who had been getting promoted to full professor before my tenure, I stopped that. Now, it made me extremely unpopular with those folks, but quite frankly, I didn't care. Because at some point, if you're going to act for justice, you're going to be unpopular with those who are wedded to the status quo. There's no way around it. Now, finally, you can recruit allies and train them to do some of the mentoring that you are currently taking on. Again, this goes back to my tiered mentorship method. I've done this, and there are external resources that can help you teach your allies what they need to get better at. So when we landed a NIH Maximizing Access to Research Careers MARC Award, I required all of the PIs to go through racial equity training. Now, it was transformative for these people because these were all folks who had, whose hearts were in the right place, but they didn't have the background. And so when they went to racial equity training, they were now equipped with the tools they needed to be able to more effectively run this program and mentor the students. Now, these things cost your institution. But at the end of the day, okay, institutions show what's important to them by what they're willing to spend money on. Okay, so if you say that diversity and inclusion are important for your institution, you show that by your budget. If you're not spending the money it takes to get these things to happen, then you're just not serious. Okay, so the enterprise of science as a whole. So I am a champion of the scientific method. So please, no one should get me wrong. Okay, I believe the scientific method is the only effective way to understand how nature works. And therefore, this method, its greatest strength is its capacity for objectivity. The enterprise describes how the tools and results of science are deployed within societies. So while the method itself is entirely capable of being objective, how the method is utilized is often not objective. And in the United States, the enterprise of science has been and is currently deployed primarily to serve the interests of persons of European descent. And that's because the enterprise of science is part of the entire enterprise of the society, whether it be legal systems, whether it be economic systems, whether it be educational systems. All of these things are mired in institutional racism. And so for people to think that just because science is an objective method, that scientists themselves and the enterprise that they're engaged in is objective is utter nonsense. And so once again, I have argued that what is required for social justice is anti-racism in science. Anti-racism is not, just I'm not a racist. I don't think racially. That's not anti-racism. Anti-racism is recognizing that these institutions are compromised by their racial ideology and racial practice. Therefore, you must take action to change these institutions. So anti-racism is an active stance. It's not I have Black friends, I have Latino friends, I have Asian friends. That's not anti-racism. Okay, that's liberalism. So I've been quoted as saying, and I do mean this, that there will never be science for the people until we have all the people in science. And what I mean by that is representative proportions in these scientific disciplines of all the folks in our society. There's no reason why we can't achieve this. None whatsoever. 50% of scientists should be women. Women are just as interested in being in science as men are. However, we know that there are structural impediments in the way these institutions work that are biased against women. We've identified what these biases are. So we need to take action to remove them. In the same way, these biases exist with regard to institutional racism. And I discussed them in the panel on systemic racism in science that I did for the AAAS Forum on Science and Technology back in October. So it's not like we need a whole bunch of new scholarship to figure this stuff out. We don't. We know what these impediments are. What is lacking is the political will to take action to remove them. That means that you're going to have to, spend some money. That's not going to make some folks happy, particularly those wedded to the status quo. But if you're serious about changing your institution, this is not going to happen, okay, by magic. Okay, we're scientists. We understand that we have to take action. So, how am I doing on time?
So it is 12:33 at the moment. So I'd say maybe about another 20 minutes or so.
Okay, I think I can do that. So, and again, there are these discussions of obstacles and opportunities. So there's the whole, leaky pipeline, faculty hiring, promotion, and tenure issue. Now, again, I see this as an opportunity gap, not an achievement gap. And it starts by defending the public schools. And, here in the South, where I'm at, private schools have been and still are used as a way to maintain racial segregation. This is also true in the North. And so while people keep raising these arguments about school choice and pedagogy, down here, most of it is simply cover for creating racial segregation in schooling. And the most insidious thing about this is that they're not using their private dollars to pay for their private schools. They're using state money to pay for their private schools. So if you really insist on having a private school, then spend your own money on it. Do not take resources away from public education. And this is really showing itself here in this time of COVID pandemic. Right now in North Carolina, and I've been following, the situation in Chicago, but I'm more familiar with what's happening here in North Carolina. Right now, the governor has called for schools to reopen. Now, my response to that is, yeah, we know that children will do better learning in person. We know that. That's not the issue here. But this is a pandemic. This is a deadly virus. Bringing people together in close quarters for extended periods of time will increase the spread of this virus. The notion that children don't get COVID 2019 is utter and pure nonsense. So to be able to do it safely, because as you're all aware, the CDC has come out with guidelines for how you can bring kids back to school safely. To do that requires resources. You have to have personal protective gear. You have to be able to distance children. You have to have cleaning supplies. You have to have testing. We don't have that. Wealthy school districts might, but most of the school districts that educate historically underserved communities, we don't have that. We're already dying at differential rates from COVID 2019. And now you want to bring these kids back into school environments to increase the pandemic? A colleague of mine is a doctor at Duke's Hospital. And this is what he told me yesterday. I serve on the COVID vaccination task force for the Episcopal Church of North Carolina. This is what the colleague told me yesterday. In the COVID ward, where people are dying, they're nothing but black and brown bodies. In the line to receive vaccination, there are nothing but white bodies. We have already seen that the rate of vaccination is twofold higher for persons of European descent in North Carolina than they are of African descent. And this isn't because of vaccine hesitancy. It's the way the vaccine is being rolled out, which differentially favors persons of European descent in the state. So when I call for the defense of public schools, I want to see kids back in school, but this has to be done rationally, and the resources have to be made available so that we can get these kids back in school safely. Okay. There are successful models of undergraduate STEM mentorship. These have been around since the 1980s. But again, to replicate these models requires funding. It doesn't materialize out of thin air. So the funding has to be made available. And of course, for the last 4 decades, the government has taken away the funding support to replicate these successful models. And so when we don't see movement in terms of changing the demography of science, this is not mysterious. Systems operate the way they're designed to. So if you end up with very few persons of color coming out of the science pipeline, it's because the system is designed to do that. The way it works does that. And so we know what these successful models are. There's an outstanding literature in the scholarship of teaching and learning about how you do this right. But to do that right requires spending dollars. Okay, so I'll go on to the next slide. So, and part of this, again, successful models, Research One institutions should be investing in programs like the University of California's Presidential Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. I was actually hired to the University of California through the President's Postdoctoral Program. And now, 30 years later, my last PhD student has also been hired to the University of California through the President's Postdoctoral Program. But there's only a few places that are doing this. So if this were more widely deployed, we might actually see a transition in the demography of the faculty at these Research One institutions. So, target of opportunity hiring treats the diversity of the faculty as an important criterion. Provosts should be devoting money and telling faculty, you will get an additional position if you can find a qualified person to be part of your department. It's amazing how when free money comes down, faculty who suddenly said, there aren't any minorities in my field. It's amazing when the money drops from the provost for that earmarked purpose, suddenly all of them are running to the provost with qualified candidates. I've seen this myself. So one rather large research institution decided to do that this year. They contacted me for an assistant professor position. Who besides me sees the problem there? They didn't even know enough to know. In fact, in the letter, they said, we got your name off a list. I'm like, excuse me, so did you write Henry Louis Gates at Harvard and invite him to apply to your institution too? As an assistant professor. What it says is they didn't even know enough to know who the people are in the field. And so I gave them, and I was nice about it. I wasn't mean. I wrote them back and I gave them a series of recommendations for how they could do this correctly. Because, you know, saying that we've had a problem, you know, acknowledging that we now want to do something about it, those are good steps. But how you actually do something about it is important. Finally, there needs to be a reform of promotion and tenure criteria, specifically rewarding racially subordinated groups and women for the mentorship that they do for students in general, but particularly for racially subordinated students and women students. This is valuable scholarship. It's valuable service to the institution. It should be rewarded in promotion and tenure. So I'm going to end on this slide, and then we'll start taking questions. So I've also been asked the question, should we teach about the history of racism and eugenics? And my answer is yes, absolutely. Evolutionary biology, in my field, has a deeply problematic history of studies that supported racism and eugenics. Okay? But this subject is literally a gold mine of logical fallacies that can be used to teach students about the scientific method and about the enterprise of science. And it's a story that's full of villains and heroes, like Dick Lewontin down below, okay? So there's much to be gained by teaching this. And so, and I think in the next slide, I'm gonna jump through, you know, I've worked on this for some time. For those who don't know my books, The Emperor's New Clothes is about the history of racial thinking in the Western world. The Race Myth is what we learn about society once we understand that history of racism in science. I have a new book coming out with my colleague Alan Goodman in the fall from Columbia University Press called Race and Racism, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. So look out for that in the fall. So quickly, yeah, so, and people ask me, can I recommend sources? There's a lot of sources on this subject. All right, so thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to address individual questions now.
All right, thank you very much. So we've had some questions coming in kind of during the time period here. So I think one that we'll start out with was submitted by Dawson White. And that question is, Dr. Graves, beyond statements on institutional websites, all the job applications I've completed within the past 18 months have required a statement on contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Can you comment on the current change, if any, you see on the prioritization of social justice in R1 institutions? Do you see them spending more money on EDI initiatives?
You know, I don't want to burst anyone's bubble on this, but it seems like there's some tokenism, and you know, let me give you an example of that. A lot of research ones are all scrambling to hire someone to be the director of diversity and inclusion on the campus. And again, on paper, that sounds like a really good thing. You know, now we think diversity and inclusion is important. So we're going to hire somebody whose main administrative requirements and priorities is going to be addressing it. So I have a good colleague who was just hired by a prominent research one in that position. But the issue, of course, is that this colleague, you know, has this office and has this title, but this person, I'm not going to give their gender, I almost gave it away. This person has little to no impact on what the institution is actually doing. So yeah, people are saying, write a statement on your diversity and inclusion efforts, which I think everybody should be able to do, by the way. But the question is, how much does it really play into who they decide to hire? And since we don't really have data yet on that from across the country. It's good that they're requiring the statement, but 5 years from now, I'd like to see data that shows that people who had equal qualifications across the board, but one of them said, you know, I've never worked on this issue, and another person says, I've been committed to this from the beginning, and gives concrete examples of what they've actually done. If those people are being hired and the other group isn't, then I'd say we're making progress. But I have no evidence of that as of yet.
All right, let me return to our, so this is, I'd say, a slightly different kind of question, but I think it's definitely related. And in some sense, it's a little broader than academia. But how should we think about the fact that certain communities have different rates of disease prevalence? For example, hypertension and kidney disease hit African-American communities harder than others. Is that a function of both environment and genetics? If there is a genetic component, do we think of that not in racial terms, but more as a fact that certain populations have factors that presuppose them to these diseases?
Okay, so that's actually a simple and a complex answer. So first, all phenotypes, and disease is a phenotype, are the product of genes, environment, and chance events during development. And so when we look at differential rates of specific diseases, we need to look at the interaction of genes, environment, and chance. So I've spent a great deal of time, including in this essay, why the non-existence of biological races does not mean the non-existence of racism, explaining that these phenotypic differentials are absolutely no evidence of a genetic predisposition for disease in African Americans. I call it the myth of the genetically sick African. And in the race myth, I examined the literature on hypertension and looked at the distribution of hypertension risk variants and hypertension protective variants in the two populations. African Americans actually have a higher frequency of hypertension protective variables and a lower frequency of the risk variables compared to European Americans. Plus, all of the risk variables for hypertension in African Americans, which have their origin in Western Africa, people in Western Africa don't display elevated hypertension. They have the same genetic variants, no hypertension. People in North America and the Caribbean show hypertension, demonstrating that you're clearly dealing with a gene by environment interaction. Now, in the new book, I summarize all sorts of studies on race and disease, and particularly what we know now about the epigenetics of environmental influences on disease. And when you look at that epigenetic profile of persons who've experienced social subordination and racism, you see a great deal of these non-nucleotide-based epigenetic risk variants in those people. So at the end of the day, to answer that question, most of the disease differential we see in persons of African descent in the United States is the result of institutional racism, not their genome. In fact, when you look at across the genome, persons of European descent have more risk deleterious genes than persons of African descent. So if we were simply looking at a genetic determinant of disease, it should be European Americans showing higher levels of disease, not African Americans. But we see the exact opposite.
Okay, Yolanda, do you want to do the just kind of logistics question, and then we can kind of get back to others?
Yes, I can go ahead and do that. Dr. Graves, thank you for your presentation. This is great work. I've learned a lot. One of the questions that we do have in the chat is, are we able to have a copy of your slides?
Absolutely. I'm going to send them to Ken right after this talk is over.
Okay, excellent. So also, we are recording today's session, so we'll have to figure out the best way to get it posted, but it will be available for additional viewing and things. And also, Joseph has sent me some copies of papers that he's written on race in academia, and I can also try to make those available along with the talk. All right, so I guess the next question that we can take a look at is one that was submitted by Keela Wilkes. And she asked, what are some examples of the barriers that you've seen for women and people of color in academia? Some of those I know sort of discussed a little bit in terms of things like tenure and promotion, but I guess maybe others that you think are important and need to be addressed.
You know, well, I'll start with women. Some of the things are again, subsections of what we see in society as a whole. So one of the major issues that a lot of my female colleagues have discussed over the course of their careers, and this by the way is a real problem in field science, is the culture of sexual harassment that dominates the way these disciplines operate. And so women are often pushed out of the field because they're unwilling to continue with these kinds of assaults on their dignity. Racial harassment is real too. I can tell you stories about early on in my career, during my master's degree, I thought nigger was my middle name because I was called it so much. So these kinds of things are sort of the most blatant examples of these impediments. But also, there are issues with regard, more subtle issues with regard to what science people think are important and which scientific questions they don't think are important. So for example, I remember interacting with people who were concerned about conservation biology. They wanted to preserve endangered species. Now, I thought that was a laudable aim, but oftentimes they did so without any regard for the people who were living in these environments as well. So one case that really comes to mind is someone who was incensed about the people in Honduras killing these endangered bears for food. And my response was, well, I understand that this is a bad thing, but these people have no choice. They've been pushed off their land by United Brands, an American corporation, and they're living in marginal habitats, and they're killing these bears because they need to feed their family. So yeah, conservation is important, but we need to look at it in the context of broader issues. And so it's a combination of both these overt cultural attitudes in the academy that work against non-traditional people, and also the more subtle ideological ones with regard to, why we do science, what we think is important, that also are barriers to people, along with the things that I already discussed in the conversation.
Okay, so another question submitted by Amira Ashraf O'Neill deals with sort of the monetary issues that you discussed, and how things can potentially change when money is available. Do you think I guess, what do you think the balance is between reallocating money that is already available versus new funding initiatives? Which of those do you think has the most potential? And in some ways, I feel like I know the answer, but maybe which of those will result in sort of better reception by university and say museum administrations?
Well, again, I mean, if you're going to talk about spending, institutions indicate their priorities by how they construct their budgets. So, yeah, man, I don't know how to say it more simply than that. So I can give you an example here at my institution. Okay, so we're a public, historically Black institution, and we are funded differentially by the state of North Carolina. We have students who come to us with variable levels of preparation to be in the university. We have some students who could have gone anywhere, but we have a lot of students who are first generation college students who come out of very poor school systems and have large gaps in their education. Now, these students can succeed in their majors, but it takes us a whole lot more effort to be able to bring these students through and to get them to the point of where they have the same competencies as the students at UNC Chapel Hill. But Chapel Hill has a much higher budget than we do. Okay, so if I were in charge of this state, I'd be putting the money into North Carolina A&T. Let me give you a real graphic example of that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to also, I'm using a virtual background, which I'm now going to get rid of. So here's my office. Okay, so I was moved in January from a 2010 state-of-the-art building that I helped to design. I'm now have an office in a building that was built in 1910. And you can get a sense of what this place looks like. Okay, this biology building has been here for 110 years. Okay, I can't find a single biology building at UNC Chapel Hill that's been there for 110 years. So the simple fact is that the University of North Carolina makes decisions about who they think are important and where they put their resources. If they gave us the same sort of expenditures as they gave UNC Chapel Hill, I think we would be making more progress with the students we have. We'd be doing better research, okay, because we don't have the infrastructure that they have. So yeah, it comes down to, it'd be great if we had all these new sources of money, but the simple fact is that there is money, and that money can be appropriated in ways that illustrate a real commitment to diversity and inclusion, but that we're not seeing that in research institutions.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, but before we do that, I just want to remind everyone that this is the first of our 4 weekly seminars in February as part of the museum's recognition and celebration of Black History Month. So please keep an eye out for our next advertisement that should be coming out later today for the registration information for next week's event. And also for those coming up later in the month. All of the seminars are going to be recorded, and we'll make sure to make them available for rewatching. Also, be sure to check out the museum's Black History Month webpage for information about all the events that are going on as part of the Black History Month celebration. So I will end with a sort of philosophical question that was submitted by an anonymous attendee, and that is racism a disease of the mind or the heart, and can it be cured?
Well, that's a major question. Now, obviously, let me tell you another story, different story. One of the most powerful cartoons I've ever seen is one in which a demonstrator, this is during the Vietnam War, demonstrator is walking back and forth in front of the White House with a sign saying "End the War." And the caption shows a person talking to this person and saying, "Why are you doing this? It's not making any difference." And the respondent says, "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it for me." In other words, if more people were to recognize the moral imperative of doing what's right with regard to how we treat other people, we would be able to make more progress with regard to ending institutional racism. Okay. Now, the good news is that Alan and I spend an entire chapter of the new book, Race and Racism, Frequently Asked Questions, addressing how to end institutional racism. So not that I'm trying to pitch our book, but I think the book will answer that question in more detail than I can give you in the few minutes I have left. But yes, I think we can end institutional racism, but it requires people to make a commitment to do so.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joseph. Just in terms of like some of the comments, I don't know if you've seen some of the things coming through, but I think everyone has really enjoyed your seminar today, and it's been a great learning experience for all of us. We definitely appreciate the time that you've taken to speak with us today, and thank you for sharing the resources such as your slides and papers and things, and we'll make sure to make those available to our audience. And thank you all, everyone, for attending. And like I said, keep an eye out for additional advertisements. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.